Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a fascinating and, I think, deeply relevant stack of sources, a collection of research on modern economic anxiety, and we're setting it against the wisdom of ancient Stoicism. We're turning it into an operating manual for your mind.
That's exactly right. Our mission today is critical, but it's also deceptively simple. We're analyzing how economic instability, inflation, rising rates, the fear of the next downturn, how it primarily affects our internal psychological state.
And we're not just guessing, we're looking to the big three.
Right. To Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus to help us clearly distinguish between, the external chaos we just cannot control and the internal clarity that is entirely within our power.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because the modern dilemma is so universally relatable. You know the feeling. Maybe it's first thing in the morning, maybe it's just before bed, but you open your phone and the numbers are just flashing at you.
Yeah.
Gas is up, food is up, rent is up, interest rates are up, and the only thing that seems determined not to increase is the money in your bank account or, the stability of your job.
And that moment, that instant trigger, is absolutely crucial. What's fascinating is that the first thing to shake isn't the physical reality of your wallet. It's not the bank account.
Yeah, not at all.
It's the mind. It's that overwhelming state we commonly call worry or financial anxiety. It's the feeling of dread before anything has actually collapsed.
The mind preemptively collapses. It often projects a complete disaster that hasn't even begun to unfold.
And this is exactly where the Stoic reframe becomes so immediately applicable. They had a precise term for that internal collapse. They called it an uncontrolled impression.
An uncontrolled impression. So it's not just a bad feeling that we have to tough out. It's actually a failure of internal governance.
Yes. You've let a rumor, a story, take the throne of your judgment without proper vetting.
A rumor in your own head.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this is why Marcus Aurelius provides the core principle that guides this entire deep dive. He wrote, it is not the event that disturbs us, but our interpretation of the event. Just think about that in the context of money.
Okay.
Inflation itself, in the raw, doesn't strike the soul directly. A crisis doesn't automatically cause despair. What causes the internal collapse is that runaway stream of thoughts inside our heads, where every worst-case scenario, homelessness, losing your dignity, total failure, is just projected on a continuous loop, demanding an emotional response right now.
So we're essentially demanding that we suffer today for a catastrophe that might only exist hypothetically tomorrow. We're borrowing pain from the future.
And paying a very high interest rate on it. We begin to live as though we have already lost the job, as though we are already completely financially ruined. And this brings us to what the sources call the childish but highly accurate question.
Which is?
If everything hasn't happened yet, why am I already suffering?
That is the fundamental inquiry we have to start with. If the money is still there today, why am I paying this crippling spiritual interest on the potential loss of that money tomorrow?
And Stoicism begins by halting that emotional loan. Its purpose is not to deny economic reality. Inflation is real, instability is real, a crisis is real, but to force a separation between that objective reality and the psychological panic. And the panic, this is the key, is entirely optional.
So this deep dive is about finding the internal structure to stand firm when the economic crisis, passes through you. When the currency shakes, the mind follows.
And our mission today is to give you the philosophical anchor to stop that follow. So let's start then with part one, the internal crisis separating reality from panic.
The anchor quote here, and this resonates across every source we looked at, it comes from Seneca. He observed that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality.
Right. And when things are stable, that sounds like a lovely philosophical platitude, something you'd see on a poster. It's easily dismissed. But when you are watching your savings dwindle or feeling the squeeze of rent, that quote becomes a concrete survival map.
A survival map? How so?
The reason it's a survival map is that the modern problem isn't just depreciating money. It's the mind losing its structural anchor entirely.
Tell me more about that loss of anchor. How is our modern anxiety different from the anxiety of people in earlier, maybe even materially poorer times?
Well, in earlier times, people might have struggled with material lack for sure, but their minds weren't being continuously dragged along, moment by moment, by indicators and forecasts and charts flashing red and green, and these endless 247 news cycles that are focused solely on crisis.
We're overloaded. We know too much data, but we understand too little of what actually matters to our immediate life.
We're drowning in data without an internal principle to filter it, and that, I think, is where Epictetus steps in with his concept concept of living off axis.
Living off axis.
Exactly. When we're living off axis, we allow things we cannot possibly control, global supply chains, central bank policy, the entire stock market, to occupy the entirety of our mental space. If you're constantly refreshing the global inflation rate on your phone, you have dedicated zero mental capacity to deciding how you will constructively spend your next hour. And that is the only thing you can control.
It makes that seemingly silly question. If I didn't read the economic news today, would inflation disappear? It makes it feel very real.
Of course, and the answer is obviously no, but the question exposes the fundamental paradox of how we consume financial information today. Reading the news doesn't help you control the economy. It gives you data you can't really use.
It can absolutely destroy your ability to keep your mind still.
Unequivocally. Stoicism doesn't teach us to ignore the crisis or bury our heads in the sand. It teaches us that clarity is the most valuable resource you have during the crisis.
So holding the mind still, Bethia, isn't about becoming emotionless or indifferent to real financial problems. It sounds like it's about a very practical discipline in the face of chaos.
It's about changing the sequence of reaction. When prices rise, the Stoic instruction is to adjust your behavior, cut consumption, budget tighter, but do not sacrifice your dignity or your character in the process.
Okay.
When the market shakes, you change your investment strategy, maybe, but you absolutely do not lose self-control or act on a panicked impulse. When the future is uncertain, you strengthen your inner resolve. You don't just give up your agency.
And we have the ultimate case study in this philosophy. Marcus Aurelius. I mean, here's an emperor managing constant wars, a devastating plague, and severe financial crises that threaten the entire Roman infrastructure. And yet, his solution was to retreat to his journal.
He wasn't journaling to escape reality. He was journaling to anchor his mind to the one thing that cannot be inflated, the one asset that cannot be taken away by any external force.
Sound judgment.
Sound judgment. In a time when the currency was literally collapsing, his core asset, his true wealth, remained his internal clarity. If he lost that, the empire and his soul would fail.
And this highlights the central paradox that the sources force us to face. Economic instability is rarely the biggest threat to the individual. The greatest danger is the lack of internal discipline, which leads to internal bankruptcy first.
Yes. A lot of people don't collapse because of sudden poverty. They collapse because of sustained panic. They don't die from a lack of funds. They suffer a kind of spiritual and psychological death because they lose direction, they lose their focus, and they lose their ability to act rationally.
So if I can't control inflation, what can I control? Let's just state it again crisply.
You control your reaction, your consumption, your thoughts, and how you maintain your character, your persona, amidst all the volatility. The external reality is the stage, the internal reality is the actor. You have to focus on the actor.
That sets us up perfectly to move into part two, the socio-psychological roots of economic fear. Because if panic is optional, why is it so overwhelming for so many of us today?
Well, the uncomfortable truth that we really have to unpack is that economic fear stems from a deep, profound sense of a loss of control, not just a lack of money. Money is just the surface measurement.
The symptom.
It's the symptom. The underlying feeling is being dragged along by invisible forces, dictated by numbers we can't touch and policies we can't influence.
And our sources suggest that modern society just pours gasoline on this fire, turning normal financial anxiety into this consuming dread.
It does, and it does it through three modern amplifiers of fear. The first one is just the sheer speed of information.
Wow.
Bad news travels infinitely faster than the human mind can process it or contextualize it.
Oh yeah, we're talking about sensational headlines, the instant market plunge alert on your phone, the red chart on the screen. They just flood our awareness daily and immediately trigger a fight or flight response.
That's it. Your mind is forced into a reaction mode before it even has time to apply judgment. And this is precisely what Marcus Aurelius warned against. Accepting these initial, often hysterical impressions without a proper review. It is the shortest route directly to anxiety.
This feeds right into what we call the no more fallacy. We feel this obligation to consume every financial news item, believing that knowing more data will somehow make us live better or safer.
And Stoicism argues that is totally backwards. Knowing more data doesn't equal living better. Knowing the right things does. Knowing things outside your sphere of control, like the bond yield in a country you don't even live in, it only creates mental clutter and noise, making internal judgment impossible. It becomes what we'll call busy uselessness.
Okay, so that's the first amplifier. What's the second?
The second is our fundamental system dependency. We live these abstracted lives built on layers of credit, supply chains, automated salaries, and stable job markets. When that complex system shakes, we don't just fear going broke. We fear losing our very foothold, the entire infrastructure of our normal life.
And this takes us straight back to Seneca's definition of poverty, which is incredibly relevant today.
It is, he said. The poorest person is not the one who has the least, but the one who needs the most to feel secure. Modern society has conditioned us to demand an immense amount, a certain lifestyle, credit availability, guaranteed supply chains, just to feel normal or safe.
So when any of those foundational expectations wobble, the fear is magnified. A small fluctuation that might have been a minor nuisance decades ago is now enough to send us into a total panic because our internal safety margin is just too small.
We've maximized efficiency, but we've minimized resilience, absolutely. And the third amplifier is collective comparison. Crisis doesn't happen privately anymore. It plays out publicly on social media, in the news, and in your community. We are constantly seeing who weathered the storm and who drowned.
And our mind immediately starts writing its own tragic comparative script.
Which is where Epictetus's warning about comparison becomes such a crucial lesson. He said that comparison places our judgment in the hands of others. If we define our success or our failure by how well our neighbor or our colleague is performing financially, we are committing a form of spiritual suicide during a crisis.
Because if they panic, you panic. If they compromise their ethics to win, you feel this pressure to compromise yours.
And this leads to the most dangerous psychological root of all: identifying your self-worth with your income or your earnings. When money depreciates or your work becomes precarious, we feel our entire dignity is shaking.
You have to ask that sharp, uncomfortable question. If I earn less than I did last year, do I become a worse person?
Intellectually, the answer is an obvious no, but the panicked mind, it acts as if the answer is yes. This internal crisis of identity, the loss of self-respect tied to external metrics, is far more damaging than the actual financial loss itself.
And the entire societal structure supports this fear through the language of crisis. Everything is a collapse, a bubble burst, or a deep bottom.
Seneca advised choosing your words like you choose your food. If you consume bad food, it makes the body sick. If you absorb chaotic, sensational, fear-based language, it makes the mind chaotic. This aggressive language doesn't help us prepare for the storm. It ensures we're already frantic and cognitively exhausted before the storm even hits.
And finally, there's the biggest betrayal of them all, the illusion of certainty. We grow so accustomed to stability during long periods of peace, and when instability returns, which it always does, it feels like an unfair betrayal of our expectations.
And Stoicism views that blind expectation as the primary source of all suffering. We are demanding a promise, perpetual stability, perpetual economic growth that life in the universe never actually made.
So that leads us to the closing question for this section. If instability is the default state of life, why do I demand certainty?
That reframes everything. A crisis doesn't prove that life is suddenly chaotic. It simply reveals the fragility of our belief in certainty. Stoicism doesn't promise financial stability. It promises the internal ability to stand firm when that stability inevitably disappears.
Okay, let's move on to part 3, exposing the hidden mechanisms of self-sabotage. Because if a crisis were just about managing numbers, it wouldn't be so exhausting. What truly drains us is the way it activates these subtle, hidden mental mechanisms that actively sabotage our own tranquility.
This is the internal enemy that we have to name and confront. Let's start with mechanism number 1.
Let's do it.
Mechanism 1, confusing cause and effect. This is the classic panic reflex. Prices rise, so we immediately think, I must work harder, run faster, grab more precarious, high-risk opportunities. We confuse activity with effectiveness.
But panic almost universally leads to poor, irreversible decisions, not efficiency.
Exactly. This is the Seneca analogy in action. No wind is favorable for the one who doesn't know where he is going. The crisis doesn't just make the road difficult, the panic makes us forget our initial grounded direction and strategy.
It's like that running in fog question. If I run faster in the fog, will I arrive sooner?
No, you'll only crash harder. The impulse to speed up when you lack clarity is the anti-stoic move. You have to slow down your judgment process in order to speed up your actual effective execution.
All right, mechanism number 2. This one feels deeply insidious, attacking our contentment, attacking the sense of enough.
Inflation constantly, relentlessly erodes our definition of sufficiency. What felt adequate yesterday, the size of your savings, the scope of your lifestyle, it feels lacking today because the cost of everything else has moved. Your mind is trained to always feel a sense of hollowing out or inadequacy.
So even if my salary is keeping pace with inflation, the mental stress comes from feeling like I am just running in place.
That's it. And when enough disappears, tranquility vanishes. Epictetus nailed this. He warned that whoever does not learn how to be content will always be poor, regardless of their actual accumulated wealth. Contentment, not capital, is the true bulwark against financial despair.
So the only way to win this game is to redefine enough internally, independent of the external market.
You have to. Which brings us to mechanism 3, one we all fall victim to when we are glued to the news. Expanding fear through forecasting?
Oh, yes.
Economic forecasts are a professional necessity for policymakers, but they are often toxic when consumed by the individual citizen. When we ingest these predictions of doom, we start living the pain of tomorrow. We are paying spiritual interest on a future disaster that is highly speculative and may never fully materialize in the way we fear.
Aurelius's reminder is essential here. Don't let the future overwhelm the present. Each day has enough of its own tasks and its own stress without borrowing pain from a speculative future. Forecasting is thinking about what might happen.
While Stoicism focuses on what is happening and what I must do about it right now.
Okay, mechanism 4.
Equating human value with performance. Crisis naturally praises the people who endure, who pivot with blinding speed, or who successfully catch the trend. Those who prioritize slowing down or maintaining steady principle are often deemed slow or inadequate by society.
This is that pressure we all feel to hustle, to burn ourselves out, just to be seen as valuable during a period of instability.
And Stoicism offers a radical counterargument. Efficiency is not virtue. Virtue is maintaining moderation and sound judgment, even when circumstances are pushing you toward a frenzy. We need to flip the narrative.
So instead of asking, if I don't speed up in a crisis, am I useless?
You should ask, perhaps by maintaining my composure, I am being wise. Preserving judgment is more critical than maximizing short-term earnings.
Okay, so mechanism 5 is what Seneca called information overload, or busy uselessness.
Constant bad news, constant updates, constantly refreshing charts. It completely removes the mind's ability to categorize. We react to everything, which means we end up controlling nothing. We feel busy, but our busyness is useless because it's not tied to an internal strategy.
So the discipline required is pretty radical. Reduce your external exposure to increase your internal judgment.
You cannot afford to spend 3 hours reading about global bond yields when those 3 hours should be spent controlling your immediate consumption.
Mechanism 6 is surrendering to the helpless victim role. When all the causes for volatility are macroeconomic, global inflation, central bank policy, it is so easy to believe we have no role to play, that we are simply leaves tossed by the wind.
But Epictetus insists that personal power lies precisely in your judgment and the small, immediate actions within your reach. Losing the belief that you have any agency is losing the last pillar of tranquility. The moment you decide the external structure is fully in charge of your happiness, you lose your internal compass.
And the final and most corrosive mechanism, eroding virtue through rationalization.
A crisis creates a perfect justification for poor choices, all in the name of survival. Small deceit, cutting corners ethically, impatience, and eroding character, all can be rationalized because everyone is doing it, or, well, I have to survive this downturn.
But this is the line Marcus Aurelius cautioned us never to cross. He wrote that we shouldn't let circumstances teach us to be a person we'd be ashamed to look back on later.
And if your financial survival requires you to compromise your virtue, you've already suffered a far greater loss than any amount of money.
The punchline here is clear. Crisis doesn't break us primarily through poverty. It breaks us through these subtle mechanisms that cause us to abandon our internal discipline.
And holding the mind still requires recognizing and refusing to let these 7 mechanisms take control.
Which brings us to part 4, the psychology of stillness, the Stoic toolkit. We have identified the enemy, the mechanisms of self-sabotage. How do we fight it? And let's start by clarifying that common misconception about stillness.
We have to. It's so important. Holding the mind still, apatheia, is not about becoming a stone devoid of feeling. That is a complete misunderstanding. Stoicism trains you to be a pillar.
A pillar, I like that.
A pillar still gets hit by the wind, still feels the gale, but it does not fall with the wind. Worry, fear, frustration, these emotions are natural and unavoidable for a human being. The problem is letting those emotions seize command of your decision-making apparatus.
The moment fear becomes the CEO of your life, you're lost.
Completely lost. And Epictetus gives us the crucial practical tool here, the gap of judgment. Between the event, the market plunge, the rising gas price, and your reaction, the impulse to panic spend or panic sell. There is a small, critical gap. Stoicism is the discipline of training that judgment so that emotion doesn't seize control in that critical space.
So how does that apply to the real-world anxiety test? We have to ask ourselves, if I worry, does worrying help me pay the bills?
And the answer is an unambiguous, hard-edged no. But worrying can and often does lead to wrong spending, wrong investment decisions, and wrong words spoken to loved ones out of irritation. The worry itself becomes the costly behavior.
So if we fill that gap of judgment with trained reason, we can prevent the costly reaction.
And that's where preparation becomes key. We look to Marcus Aurelius and his famous morning practice, the premeditation of evils, or premeditatio malorum.
Which is often misunderstood as just being pessimistic.
Yeah. It is not pessimism. It is robust psychological preparation. Aurelius prepared his mind daily to meet selfish people, ungrateful colleagues, and critically uncontrollable events like war or financial ruin. If you walk into a financially volatile year expecting perpetual stability, you have already put yourself at a massive disadvantage when the inevitable instability arrives.
Because the Stoic view is that instability is the default state of life. Stability is merely a temporary phase, a lucky break.
And when we accept instability as the default, the mind stops exhausting itself fighting reality and starts working with the reality it has been given. And this internal work relies on three highly uncomfortable but essential pillars of Stoic psychology.
Okay, what's pillar one?
Separating the event from the story.
Okay.
Inflation is the event. I'm about to collapse and lose everything because I'm inadequate is the story. This practice, cutting the story away from the event, is repetitive and often exhausting because the mind loves drama, but it is the core discipline.
So we can use the self-reflection test here. If I only state exactly what is happening without any embellishment, would I still panic?
And usually the panic subsides significantly because panic requires narrative fuel and needs that dramatic worst-case projection. If you can only state, the value of my investments dropped 10% this quarter, the problem is manageable and objective.
But if you add, and that means I failed, and I'm a terrible provider, and my future is ruined.
The panic takes over and the story controls you.
Okay, second pillar.
Shrinking the scope of worry. The panicked mind wants to embrace the whole global economy, the national debt, and the future of all currencies simultaneously. Stoicism forces a sharp retreat to the smallest, most actionable unit.
So you can't fix global inflation.
But you can fix this week's necessary expense. You can't control interest rates, but you can control this month's skill accumulation to improve your position. Seneca said the one who endures little is the richest, not because they're lacking material things, but because their desires are not stretched thin by trying to grasp the entire world.
And the third, and probably the toughest pillar, which seems so counterintuitive in times of scarcity, practicing voluntary discomfort, or hardening.
This is one of Seneca's most powerful and rarely used tools. He advised occasionally living like the poor, simple food, simple clothing, abstaining from comfort, not for punishment, but for fear eradication.
Fear eradication.
It's proof to the mind that it can endure hardship. If you intentionally spend a weekend eating only beans and rice, not out of necessity, but as an exercise, you prove to your subconscious mind that the worst-case scenario isn't fatal.
So it's asking the simple, almost defiant question. If I lower my standard of living slightly, will I die?
No. But the fear of that suffering will die a little bit more. Those who are entirely unprepared for hardship are the ones who panic when they're forced to endure it. Those who have already practiced enduring, who know factually that they can survive on less comfort, they retain their self-control when circumstances inevitably force them downward.
Another crucial skill mentioned is delaying your reaction.
Absolutely. When bad news hits a market plunge, an unexpected bill, a notice of rising debt, the rule is simple. Do not decide immediately. Let a night pass before making a major decision or sending a panicked email. Marcus Aurelius called this the silence of judgment.
You need that internal silence for the rational, composed mind to wake up and displace the frantic, emotional one.
And finally, the refusal to wallow in self-pity. Stoicism is not heartless. It allows for sadness or worry. You're human. But it forbids lingering in self-pity.
Why?
Because self-pity softens us when we need to be hardened. And it consumes massive amounts of energy that are critically needed for adaptation and survival strategy. You just cannot afford to waste energy mourning a perceived loss when you need that energy to strategize for tomorrow.
So the summary here is that holding the mind still isn't about being unshaken. It's about shaking without breaking, worrying without confusion, and enduring without losing yourself.
And this leads us directly to part 5. personal impact and the uncomfortable choices. We're moving from the theory of the mind to the implementation of action, looking at how economic crisis attacks us through 1,000 small daily cuts, and how stillness means ensuring those cuts don't strike your character.
The first and most common cut is to our money and consumption reflexes. The immediate panic reflexes, hoarding, chasing risky get-rich-quick schemes, or buying things, even small things, to feel a momentary sense of safety or control.
And Stoicism demands the opposite maneuver, tightening the focus to see clearly. Seneca's wisdom on wealth is our guide here. He said richness is the distance between desire and ability. Inflation constantly widens this gap.
So the Stoic strategy is to reduce desire, thereby shrinking the gap, before trying to increase your income to close it.
Exactly. And we need to make this practical. What is the conversation you have to have with yourself before a purchase?
You have to ask the practical question, devoid of emotion. If I don't buy this thing, what will truly, objectively happen?
And usually nothing serious happens. But the panic mind treats every constrained decision, every time you choose the generic brand or skip a meal out, as a life or death scenario that requires emotional mourning.
Which is where the first difficult Stoic solution comes in.
Temporarily accepting a lower standard of living without complaint, without comparison, and crucially, without self-deprecation.
That without complaint part is so hard. It's easy to cut spending, but it's difficult to do so without becoming bitter or judging yourself against others who aren't making those cuts.
It challenges the ego. It's Seneca's full exercise. Live poorly for a few days to remind the mind that dignity is entirely separate from comfort. If you can perform this reduction with good cheer and internal composure, you have gained internal freedom regardless of your bank balance.
The second area of impact is work and status. Instability makes jobs precarious, and since so many of us tie our self-worth to our job title and income, the self shakes when the job shakes.
Epictetus's challenge cuts right through this modern obsession. He asks, "Who are you?" when the title disappears. If the answer to that frightens you, you have fundamentally misplaced your value. Your worth is inherent, not derived from a company's organizational chart or your annual bonus.
So the difficult Stoic solution is detaching your dignity from your position. You can lose a job without losing character. You can reduce your income without reducing your human worth.
But this detachment cannot be theorized. It has to be practiced now before the layoff notice arrives. If you ask yourself, if I do the exact same work but no one praises me, titles me, or pays me extra for it, is it still worth doing? If your answer relies entirely on that external validation, then the crisis will expose you to profound suffering.
Impact number 3, and perhaps the most painful, relationships. Financial strain is notorious for turning into sharp words, blame, and irritation just dumped onto the nearest person.
This demands the difficult Stoic solution of selective silence and conscious management of your mental spillover. Not suppressing every emotion, but strictly ensuring you do not speak unless the purpose is constructive. Do not dump your fear onto the nearest person just to lighten your own emotional load.
Right. Aurelius reminds us, don't let the crisis turn you into a person your family wouldn't want to live with.
Exactly. Preserve the character of your relationships, which are truly priceless.
And the final impact, soothing consumption. Buying things, even minor treats, to regain a temporary sense of control or to soothe profound financial anxiety.
A subtle psychological trap. The difficult Stoic solution here is simple but hard. Delay purchases. Give yourself a 24 to 48 hour cool-off period. This is an exercise in disciplined impulse control, not just a savings technique. You will find that many perceived needs, the things we buy to soothe the emotional mind, they just disappear entirely once that initial urgency passes.
So if I don't buy things to reduce worry, what do I use to stand firm against the anxiety?
Discipline, moderation, and internal clarity. Crisis doesn't ask if you are afraid. It asks how prepared you are to endure. The one who keeps a still mind is not the one who loses the least money, but the one who absolutely doesn't lose himself in the process.
Let's move to part 6, engaging with economic structure beyond blame. When the economy shakes, the human reflex is almost always to seek a culprit. Policymakers, banks, politicians. It's the luxury of blame.
It feels good to point a finger because it shifts agency away from ourselves. But Stoicism denies the luxury of blame, not because the system is innocent, but because blame does not help us stand firm. It only diverts energy.
Marcus Aurelius viewed the universe as operating by its own laws, and it doesn't owe us stability.
And the economy is the same. It has no malice or compassion. It simply reacts to millions of collective human behaviors. Volatility is the inevitable result of human action.
So the blame test is simply, if I prove someone is wrong, will my money come back?
No, but your mind will expend valuable energy in bitterness, resentment, and rage. Stoicism demands an attitude of radical acceptance, treating the economic structure like the weather. You don't argue with a hailstorm, you simply wear appropriate clothing and take shelter.
And that acceptance leads us back to Epictetus's core distinction, differentiating between what is within your control and what is external.
Monetary policy, economic cycles, global inflation, these are external, not in your power. But how you spend, how you improve your skills, how you choose your risks, and how you maintain your discipline, those are yours. You must ruthlessly retreat to the boundary of what you control.
A huge mistake people make during a crisis is the belief that they must become an expert in macroeconomics to survive. This is the danger of cluttering knowledge.
Seneca warned against knowledge that confuses. Knowing things that don't lead to direct action only makes us weaker and more confused. It builds intellectual noise, not wisdom. You don't need to read every policy report from the central bank. You need to know exactly what you control in your concrete life today. Knowledge should lead to action. If it leads only to worry, cut it out.
The economic structure also creates the illusion of speed. When reckless risk takers or opportunistic compromises seem to win in a crisis, they are often celebrated, leading others to believe they must trade principle for survival.
And Stoicism offers a fundamental counterargument. Surviving by losing virtue is a slow form of defeat. The goal is to avoid actions you would be ashamed to recall later. A crisis is when the internal narrative of your life is truly being written.
So we have to apply the victory test. If I make money in a way I wouldn't tell my child, is that a victory?
No. If you lost your character in the process, you have failed the ultimate test. Furthermore, the structural reality requires us to abandon the expectation of immediate fairness. The economy does not reward virtue in the short term. The good person can struggle intensely, and the compromised person can profit handsomely.
That is a bitter pill to swallow.
It is. But Stoicism doesn't promise quick rewards for living right. It promises that living right prevents you from self-destructing while you are waiting for the reward or waiting for the cycle to change.
So the defining question isn't how to avoid volatility, but what kind of person do I want to be when volatility happens?
Exactly. Do you want to be panic-stricken, bitter, compromised, or centered? You don't need to control the entire economy to survive. You need to control how you stand within the economy. Handing your mind over to the structure means losing before the money runs out.
And now we've arrived at part 7, the true Stoic strategy and the real promise. We've identified the psychological battlefield and the mechanisms of attack. So now, what is the posture of living required to maintain stillness?
It is built on 6 small, repeatable, uncomfortable but effective choices that become daily habits.
Strategy 1.
Reestablish the control boundary daily. Epictetus's constant reminder has to become your morning mantra. What is in my power and what is not? This boundary must be repeated every single day.
Prices, cycles, policies, not in your power.
Your spending habits, your reaction to bad news, preserving your character, and the effort you put into your work entirely in your power.
So the simple daily test is this in my hands? If not, do not allow it to take up mental space. That simple refusal is the daily work of freedom in Stoicism.
Strategy 2, the discipline of preparing for loss, premeditatio malorum. This is the toughest, but also the most powerful and liberating lesson. Remind yourself that you might lose money, position, comfort, and stability. You accept this possibility fully, but you make the internal pact that you must not, under any circumstances, lose sound judgment.
And the liberating question that follows from this dark preparation is, if the worst happens, if I lose everything external, what do I still retain?
And the correct answer is never money or property or status. It is discipline, skills, character, and the ability to start again. If you have those things, you are never truly bankrupt. You have minimized the potential damage of any external shock.
Strategy 3, shrink life to expand inner strength. During inflation, the reflex is to fight furiously just to maintain your current standard of living. Stoicism recommends reducing voluntarily to increase your freedom.
Live simpler, buy less, spend slower. And do this not from a place of fear or perceived lack, but as a proactive reminder to your mind that you can survive without panic. Seneca's point. The one accustomed to little is not threatened by scarcity. They are already proof against it. This voluntary reduction builds psychological capital.
Strategy 4. Hold virtue as the non-inflated asset.
Money depreciates rapidly. Reputation fluctuates wildly. Opportunities come and go. Virtue, your character, your integrity, your self-control is the only asset that cannot be taken away unless you willingly abandon it yourself.
So before every decision, you have to ask, will this decision make me worse in terms of character?
And if the answer is yes, the price is higher than the financial cost, guaranteed.
Strategy 5. Separate survival from panic.
Stoicism allows for survival actions, changing careers, working more, tightening the belt. But it absolutely forbids survival in a state of lost self-control. Work as if you have plenty of time, even when the circumstances suggest you don't. Maintain your composure. That calmness is your critical competitive advantage over the frantic crowd.
And finally, strategy 6. Maintain a still segment daily.
You must reserve a period each day, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, that is not dominated by money. No calculations, no long-term worries, no news reading. Use that time for stillness, for walking, for simple reflection or writing. This is where you remind yourself, I'm not a number, I'm not a chart, I am not the market. This internal retreat is where the mind restores its axis and reclaims its sovereignty.
So the true promise of Stoicism in a time of crisis is not that you will win or emerge wealthier.
No, it's the quiet guarantee that you will not be broken by the crisis from within. When money depreciates, you retain moderation. When the future is dark, you retain judgment. When the system shakes, you retain character. That is the true, non-inflated victory.
And that brings us to our final thought. We've discussed that inflation weakens money and that a crisis shakes the system. But the most profound truth here is this. If Stoicism demands we practice voluntary discomfort today, are you actually investing in the most non-inflated asset available, your own resilience for the future?
The power, at the end of the day, is yours. You determine your internal value.
We encourage you to take this deep dive and consider those 7 mechanisms of self-sabotage we identified. Which one do you need to confront first in your own life to truly stand firm? Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.